Welcome the Siddhi webinar series, Education Week. And today we have an excellent lecture on fluid thinking by Dr. Ashish Jaiswal. Before we start the discussion, let me just start with Siddhi. Siddhi means, the acronym is Self-Reliant India, Discussions and Dialogues for Human Innovations. So Siddhi was basically an initiative to commemorate Mahatma Gandhi's model of equitable, inclusive and sustainable development, and focus on how technology can play a constructive role in providing solutions to problems afflicting urban and rural India, and also to create a platform to bring experts, public and stakeholders, other stakeholders together. This is led by the Office of Global Engagement, IIT Madras. Today's event will be live streamed at IIT Madras YouTube channel, and the recordings will be available in Siddhi YouTube channel, also in Siddhi YouTube channel 2-3 days. You can submit your questions about the talk in the Q&A in the Zoom module, so that we can respond to your questions. The speaker will respond at the end of the talk. So Siddhi's aim is basically to create synergies for transforming India. It involves academia, industry experts, policymakers, NGOs, social entrepreneurs, think tanks, and the general public, to name a few. Just to say a few words about today's speaker, Dr. Ashish Jaiswal. Ashish Jaiswal is actually a best-selling author and an internationally renowned scholar on principles, methods, and philosophies of education. His latest book is a bestseller. It's called Fluid. It's about philosophy of education and elaborates how great minds of human civilization across countries and disciplines and time broke the identity labels of artists, scientists, and entrepreneurs. It's a very important point actually, because all the disciplines we kind of create silos, but we have to understand that genius doesn't have any disciplinary boundaries. His another book is How to Reform a Business School. It's a multi-year case study of Yale School Management, and it's actually a first-hand account as a visiting research fellow of how Yale transformed its business school, and with the help of an integrated curriculum. And now I hand over the microphone to Professor Raghunathan Rangaswamy, Dean of Global Engagement, IIT Madras, to say a few about Siddhi and also the author. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sudarshan. I think Sudarshan has given a good overview of Siddhi. We have started this, maybe 5-6 months back, and there have been some really exciting seminars and webinars that we have heard in this platform. I'm particularly happy about the sequence of these 3 webinars that we have for all of you. Yesterday, we heard how universities can partner with high schools so that there is peer-to-peer learning. Today, we have a very, very interesting webinar on what constitutes, genius, and many of the views that we might have to rethink. So I'm really looking forward to the webinar today. And of course, the webinar tomorrow, again, takes the same challenge of how you have universities help schools and so on from a very Indian perspective, work that has been done at IIT Madras. So I think all these 3 webinars put together, I think make for a very compelling and interesting package for this education week. And of course, you just have to Google today's speaker to see that he is a best-selling author. And the topic of today's webinar sounds very exciting. And I myself am looking forward to hearing Dr. Ashish Jaiswal speak. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Ashish.
Thank you, Dr. Raghu. Thank you, Dr. Sudarshan. I hope I am audible.
Yes, very much so.
I welcome everyone. And I thank Team Siddhi and IIT Madras for inviting me. I'll start sharing my screen. Right. Okay. So I welcome everyone, and today, as it was rightly introduced, today I will be shedding light on what is fluid thinking, a fluid mind, or fluidity in the context of learning, whatever you want to call it, and how it is a common sort of approach across those who have contributed significantly to the human civilization. And interestingly, it is not restricted to a discipline or in fact to an era. So fluidity, if you sort of probe deeply, you would come across that it's an approach which cuts across disciplinary boundaries, and it also sort of cut across the time line of human civilization. So one of the interesting things when we talk about geniuses is that sort of a dichotomy, or rather a paradox, that if whether someone is a born genius and hence he or she is able to break the disciplinary boundaries with ease, or if one becomes, or at least gets sort of pushed in the direction of becoming a great mind, if you are breaking the boundaries. So whether you are born and then break boundaries, or whether you break boundaries of disciplines and hence become a great mind. So that's a paradox, and a lot of people have different views on it. In order to sort of probe deeply into what exactly is fluid thinking, or to sort of create the definition of fluid thinking, and I must share that for me it is, I have probed deeply enough into understanding what is fluid thinking and what exactly, and try to kind of understand the depths of where exactly it reaches to. And I've found that it is quite deep and cuts across the disciplines, and one has to kind of keep practicing, keep learning to understand it more and more. So before even reaching to the definition, the basic definition of fluidity, I would like to start with what is anti-fluidity. And it's very obvious, and I've tried to kind of summarize it on three sort of pillars, and which are very obvious, that it's the mindset which tells us that artists only do arts, scientists only do science, and businessmen only do business. And this mindset is, it consolidates during our initial learning journey. And it contributes to creating a subject-centric worldview. If you think education as a vast ocean, we can understand that these disciplines are more like islands, and we are kind of told that we need to remain on our respective island to become a specialist in a particular field. So we tend to adopt to island-centric worldview, and it has been kind of also confirmed by V. Ramakrishnan, who got a Nobel Prize in 2009 on his work on ribosomes. And he goes on to say that currently the children are forced to specialize, or to sort of isolate themselves into their particular sort of chosen specialization, and kind of disassociate themselves from everything else which is assumed to be useless in terms of what they consider as specialization is. So it consolidates in our learning journeys, and very early in our learning journeys, we start kind of narrowing ourselves down. And obviously, it carries on in our professional lives, and we eventually then, if we are not evolving in terms of our learning journeys, or if we are not learning every day, then it gets hardwired, and we start sort of adopting this anti-fluid attitude towards the world, and from there it emerges our sort of biases, disciplinary biases, our labels, our molds, and we start sort of guarding our disciplinary boundaries very fiercely. One of the great works, or a seminal book, was written by C.P. Snow, who was incidentally a scientist as well as a novelist, who got the opportunity to work with both the camps during World War II. Sort of he makes very interesting observations in the two cultures and the scientific revolution. He goes on to say that I felt I was moving, and I quote, that I felt I was moving among two groups, comparable in intelligence, identical in race, not grossly different in social origin, earning the same incomes, who had almost ceased to communicate, sort of, and had very little in common. So this is what C.P. Snow observes in his work, and he kind of goes on to sort of highlight the conflicting or the hostile attitude of the two groups, the scientists and the non-scientists, and as you can read that, so he clearly defines the lack of sort of compassion towards the other discipline, and sort of a dismissive or a hostile attitude towards whether you're a scientist, towards the ones who are considered to be not scientists or the hard scientists, and the ones who work in sort of like humanities or sociology and social sciences, having sort of considering scientists as brash and boastful and aware of the human condition. Again, another person, interesting person, if you can read V.S. Naipaul, the Nobel laureate in literature. He sort of regrets going or studying English at Oxford, and wished that he studied science in his undergrad. And he goes on to say, as it is written, that that he thinks that he would have been a better person. Here I would also like to introduce a very interesting term which I came across while I was sort of researching on the evolution of business school curricula, and the term is physics envy. And in physics envy, it's like around 60s, there was this the two major reports came on. They sort of dissected business school curricula and came out with this sort of profound recommendations that business schools are more like trade schools, and they're not like strong. They're not sort of academically rigorous, and the research is also like very fluffy. And that sort of established a trend which was termed as physics envy, that most of the scientific literature of business world then started gearing towards becoming more and more quantitative driven, and sort of and dense and heavy, and kind of most of the papers was sort of in that direction where it sort of took it away from the core principles of business management. So this was again sort of a reflection of how discipline sort of are at conflict to each other during our educational journeys. Now, if we sort of understand from what is anti-fluidity, we then can safely arrive at the initial sort of footsteps into fluid thinking, and as it's clear that the fluid thinkers, they refuse to jail themselves inside the disciplinary boundaries, and they're curious to break the mold and question everything that cannot be questioned at that particular point in time. And they're pretty thick-skinned, and you have to be pretty thick-skinned in order to challenge the existing norms, and which comes into your direction in the form of mockery and humiliation, and you then have to sort of pierce through it and remain sort of truthful to your quest for new knowledge, and then you sort of have nothing, no sort of umbrella to hide under. You're exposed in terms of, your current positions, because largely it is uncertain, because you're in the direction of researching and exploring and finding new things. And then at that point in time, you are somehow like an outlier or an outcast. And then you are kind of, you have to then face the wrath. Here I sort of start with sort of then that fluid thinkers, the first of the lot, whom I explain at length in my book, and say that the artist who sort of does science, and I want to kind of read his letter, very interesting letter that this gentleman writes. I, your faithful servant, understand that it has been your intention. So he's writing this letter to a king, to the Sultan, and he's sort of proposing that, and look at the language that he says, that I, your faithful servant, understand that it has been your intention to erect a bridge from Galata to Istanbul, which is Istanbul, across the Golden Horn. But this has not been done because there were no experts available. I, your subject, have determined how to build the bridge. So he proposes this design of a single span bridge, which on your right, I've sort of kind of created a bad copy of the initial design of this gentleman, and he sort of proposes a sort of a single span bridge with no supporting pillars, and over the sort of, so that tall ships can sail through. It's almost 130 feet in height, and this is 15th century, and it surprises us, and a lot of people would know also, that this gentleman is known more famous, or he's more famous for his painting Mona Lisa, and he's Leonardo da Vinci, but it's very interesting, if you read this letter, and he signs it as an architect and engineer / engineer, and doesn't even mention that he's a painter or an artist, and he doesn't even understand the difference between artist and a scientist. And that's when, the more I read about him and his work, I realize that there is no distinction in his mind. The way, unfortunately, those distinctions, those silos, and those sort of boundaries and boxes are being created in our minds. So this is one of the example, and sort of another example which I came across while researching on fluid thinking is the ancient musical instrument mridang. And this is again very interesting for me. I never came across this work during my school or my college or even after that. And here it is the work of a scientist who sort of goes on to decipher the unique sort of quality of this ancient Indian musical instrument. And mridanga, incidentally, is the only percussion instrument in the world which doesn't produce inharmonic overtones. So, I mean, I have dedicated an entire chapter in my book where I sort of start with saying that I have no clue when I read this paper, and so it's his work of C.V. Raman, again, Nobel laureate. I had no idea that C.V. Raman had done this work on mridanga, and he goes on to explain that the side which produces the harmonic overtones, which is tuned, has 3 heads. So he deciphers it at great length. So initially he published a sort of a paper in Nature in 1920, and then a sort of a lengthier paper in Proceedings of the Indian Academy of Sciences in 1934, and where he also explains that the tabla is kind of, if you divide mridang into 2 parts, then it sort of transforms itself into the later sort of century musical instrument tabla. But I sort of the way we are taught, that's what I felt, that it's a very plain Jane kind of learning in our school, in our schools, or our learning journeys are very sort of stressful, and they're not fascinating as ideally they should be. So they're devoid of any such kind of interesting linkages, and the work of, so I would not, or I'm sure that not many would be aware of how sort of apart from Raman effect, what kind of other works C.V. Raman did. And this marriage of science and arts in his work, for me, was very interesting. And I was very impressed. And it took me a lot of time to understand even his work. But, you know, it was a great sort of learning experience and very fulfilling. And this is also an example of how we sort of create these sort of biases in the minds of our students and learners, that, you know, where we do not carry this image of scientists kind of understanding sort of sur or tal or shruti and all that. Another sort of example which I give in my book is of a businessman who does arts and science. And here is a very interesting sort of a diagram where I mean, it's from my book, and I sort of gave the journey of iPhone, and I say that, you know, it starts in the year 19 sort of you know, much beyond in the 19th century, and kind of I in fact I sort of mention it, that, you know, find out to read that how iPhone journey starts in 1837, and I sort of, while I went through how Steve Jobs eventually arrived at the iPhone design or Mac design, or, you know, iPod, I realized that, you know, the disciplines, you know, people who are, or like the fluid thinkers, they cut across disciplines, and in fact, knowledge also cuts across disciplines and sort of travels freely and jumps from sort of one dimension to other and spheres, and then kind of assimilate and then create sort of remarkable, you know, products. Here, you know, I would briefly shed light on the iPhone journey and how sort of Steve Jobs consciously dabbled with arts and science. It wasn't an unconscious effort. It was a very conscious effort of kind of marrying, you know, these three sort of pillars. Froebel was a German teacher or an educationist who coined the term kindergarten, and who designed wooden toys called Froebel gifts. And he created these wooden toys, linear wooden toys, and kind of introduced them to the children for sort of, you know, so that they could learn while playing. And these Froebel gifts, incidentally, then eventually inspires the Danish carpenter who created the billion-dollar enterprise, Lego. So Froebel toys were quite popular you know, in those times, and eventually one of the primary school teacher from one of the exhibitions buys these toys for her child and presents him as a gift. Now this child happens to be Frank Wright, the architect, and Frank Wright goes on to become an iconic an architect, and he introduces the concept of linearity in the building design in the US, and from sort of sloping roofs to sort of minimal open layout and glass facades and, you know, minimal building designs. And Steve Jobs happened to be living, you know, spend his childhood at one of the Frank Wright inspired buildings. And, you know, Steve Jobs in his official biography quotes that, you know, his design inspiration was inspired by, you know, one of the Hitchler homes, which was then inspired by Frank Wright design. Simple, linear, minimal, and he introduces this philosophy, design philosophy, into iPad and iPod, and then the other sort of Apple products. And Steve Jobs, although, you know, famously is known as a college dropout, but he was, for the time he went and to his college, he was kind of, you know, moving into two groups. He had two sets of friends, one, you know, who were engineers, and the other set of friends who were artists, so to say. I mean, like, and he sort of discussed different things, and with both sets of friends. So he was he was conscious of the fact that he has to kind of break these boundaries. Now comes the sort of the final component of my presentation, which is fluid thinking anti-specialization, or becoming jack of all trade, or a generalist. And I would say that I'm afraid not, because I coin a different term, which I call fluid specialist. And fluidity is not becoming jack of all trade. Jack of all trade, incidentally, was a term which was first introduced, I don't know whether everybody knows this, for William Shakespeare, because William Shakespeare was not the typical writer of his times, and he was an educated writer, paradoxically, who emerged from the countryside, and he broke the mold of writing at the time, this language and everything, and because of his dabbling into various fields, he's called jack of all trade by Robert Greene, or an upstart crow, as he called Shakespeare. I came across this question while I was kind of going through fluidity, that is fluidity being jack of all trade, and how does one kind of arrive at that balance of specialization and fluidity? And I sort of introduced this fluid wheel model of specialization, and I consider it, I mean, it's a work in progress, but I consider it as a very interesting sort of tool, not only in our general sort of life of specialization, but also when it comes to a particular project or a product. For example, that, I can have the hub of my sort of specialization, which could be, I can be a doctor. So I give a lot of examples of, doctor, engineer, or you can give sort of fluid cardiologist, so to say. So what constitutes your hub, and what constitutes these spokes? So what is your fulcrum? So your fulcrum remains cardiology, and the spokes is from where you derive from. So it's a model which has applicability in your professional life, but it also has applicability when you're kind of working on a specific project. So you're consciously designing a fluid wheel and sort of marrying the sort of drawing from all the spheres and then narrowing it down to a particular sort of area. One of the examples which I give in my book is I take the example of a smart city specialist, because fluid wheel, incidentally, becomes even more important in the current times, in the machine age, and in the era of artificial intelligence, where the definitions of jobs, and I sort of go on explaining, and obviously most of you are aware of that, how the jobs are changing and the redundancies, and what sort of will help us survive and be relevant in the age of artificial intelligence. And I take example of one such specialist of the modern times, because when we are in our schools, most of the time you're like engineers, doctors, and all that, the basic definitions. But now the definitions of our specialist and the role and requirement is changing. So here it is that who's a smart city specialist? An architect, urban planner, engineer, an IT specialist, a builder, bureaucrat, entrepreneur, environmentalist. So like the Indian government has this initiative, smart cities. So who designs smart cities at the end? And I say that, how about including a sociologist in the list as well? And why I include a sociologist is that, interestingly, the first master plans of 18 cities of India was designed by none other, not a sort of a conventional architect or urban city specialist, but a sociologist, Peter Giddis. And he, in fact, was, interestingly, I call him a fluid specialist, because he was slightly wary of the specialists or the designers who are kind of isolating their own respective areas. And he calls like a city was like a flower, inseparable, interwoven. And he criticized the isolated approach of specialists. And as you can read that, each of the various specialists remain too concentrated on their own single specialism, and not kind of looking at the flower as a whole. And interestingly, Giddis was also influenced by Indian sort of philosophy of holism, which he sort of quotes in his one of his books, or his master plan of Kapurthala in 1917. So I introduce a fluid wheel of a smart city specialist. And I say that, a smart city specialist, I mean, he could be an architect, or he could be a sociologist, or he could be anyone. But while he's designing this particular project, he has to first decide the hub of his wheel. And here, for example, I have chosen happy and healthy family as the central focus of the design. And then I open up and, create spokes which cut across, areas which I might sort of would have slipped from my mind, because, we see a lot of neo-development in India, for example, Gurgaon. And, what I realize is that, it lacks few spokes. And one of the spokes it lacks is the rehabilitation or the migration, or kind of, this, it is these monoliths, one after the other. And, this sort of Indian life where you are kind of marrying the life and vibrancy and the small markets and the middle class and the lower middle class also kind of living, gelling together. So it's like, it's a very difficult model which was kind of copied from the West and kind of, introduced. So what, I mean, like it may sort of, not as a smart city specialist, I introduced this idea just as an educationist. But this is what I sort of propose, that, there could be a smart city specialist fluid wheel, there could be a cardiologist, fluid cardiologist. I also give example of Dr. Amartya Sen, and explain that how he also sort of cuts across various disciplinary sort of dimensions, and then create his own fluid wheel. Sort of, one of the things is that, so I started also looking at few Nobel laureates and their kind of what is their position regarding fluid thinking, and do they also consider it as, adopting a generalist approach? And I came across, actually, interestingly, quite a few who, in fact, in their own sort of words, defined sort of what how them, because again, Nobel laureates could be, they can be considered as the specialists of the highest order. And if they are talking about kind of drawing sort of, or getting influenced or getting inspired and getting helped by opening up to other fields and not sort of getting too narrow into their own sort of set of work, then also it's a piece of an evidence that, which kind of consolidates fluid thinking. So, like, as I say, Francis Crick, he mentions that, because of his background in physics, he was able to decipher the double helix DNA molecule, which he says that for other biologists lacking in physics background, they were not able to kind of identify that shape. Or Chalfie, who sort of advocates social science and humanities, and his sort of interaction with the other side, if I can say so. Another person in this with this sort of thought is I would like to kind of show her video and then end my talk, and then take questions. So I would like to show you rather than speak at what she has to say about fluid thinking. And she is give me a sec.
If they were not the most positive experience, all the.
Can you sort of, I was able to, I'm not able to bring her or pull her out. Can you guys see me?
Yeah, we can see you, but the video
Not,
is not.
not the person.
Video is not playing.
Let me just stop share and do it again, because I was trying to pull this off, but it didn't happen. There. Give me a second. Yeah, I think so. If I can do it again. Yes, it takes some time.
Studying Russian literature to aerospace engineering and chemical. All those experiences made me who I am. The diversity of background that I have, which runs the gamut from studying Russian literature to aerospace engineering and chemical engineering. I speak a number of languages. I've been interested in many things over my lifetime. I didn't actually become a professor of chemical engineering until I was 30 years old. I was doing many other things before that, including being a taxi driver. All those experiences, even if they were not the most positive experiences, made me who I am. And I think the diversity of experience is makes me very different from everybody else.
Yeah, so this was another Nobel laureate who, Frances Arnold, who got a Nobel Prize in 2018 for chemistry. And on sort of this note, I would like to sort of take a pause here, or rather end my presentation on fluid thinking. So broadly, if I have to summarize, one of the distinguishing factors in my work on fluid thinking is that it sort of sees from the learner's perspective rather than the departmental or the teacher's perspective. Because most of the interdisciplinary work, they focus on the other side. So in fluid thinking, it sort of brings the power into the hands of the learner, and it sort of triggers or ignite that process in your mind where you are kind of constantly aware or conscious of how you need to break the boundaries, because it's not a one-time affair. It's like you have to be at it every day, because otherwise you slip back into your sort of molds. So I would like to sort of stop here and give the rein to Dr. Sudarshan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal. It's a fantastic talk. And we have quite a few questions, and some of them are in the chat box, some of them are in the Q&A box.
Right.
Some of the questions I would just like to read so that you can respond.
Yeah.
The questions vary from very specific to very general.
Right.
I'll just read the question. One question is, what actually makes a person think fluidly? What is the driving force?
Yeah. So should I take them one by one?
Please, yeah.
You know, so I have to confess that this particular approach goes beyond your learning mindset, and it dabbles into the field, it dabbles into the dimension of philosophy and to an extent spirituality, or kind of that realm where you want to find out or constantly in quest of the purpose of your own sort of self. So it, in a way, sort of, what is the trigger? I probably would not be able to point to whether it's, you are pushed in that direction by your parents, or you get that learner's mind, that environment initially in your learning journey or later on, or it is something intrinsic. But I think that there could be any sort of catalyst in this whole sort of gamut. And and I think that it is also, sometimes very intrinsic, where you are kind of in your own search, in your own quest, and you realize that. So, rather than saying that it is something which you're forced into by the circumstances, or let's say in the artificial intelligence age, you are bound to kind of practice fluidity, or you'll have to practice fluidity. That's what I sort of argue in my book. Rather than saying that, I would say that it is also, a function of the human sort of a spirit, which kind of gets doused or buried by the stressful learning environment which gets created around us. And there's a lot of noise and a lot of pressure when it comes to education. And I think that if there's a kind of a right set of stimulant, probably a person would start his or her journey on the path of fluidity. That could be one of the things. And I mean, and I'm slightly reluctant to say that someone is a born fluid mind. I mean, that's possible, but I would say that circumstances also play a very important role, the right kind of circumstances. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
So there is a very interesting question from Professor Muralidharan about Darwin's early days and also his later. There are two Darwins, right? So,
yes.
See, Darwin's. There is a quotation there.
Three Darwins.
Darwin says that, poetry of kinds gave me great pleasure, and even as a schoolboy, took intense delight in Shakespeare, especially in the historical plays. I've also said that formerly pictures gave me considerable and music to a great extent delight. Now for many years I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I have tried lately to read Shakespeare and found it so intolerably dull and that it nauseated me. So actually it's a very interesting transformation for Darwin, but it doesn't actually preclude your position. But how do you explain this sudden split personality kind of thing of Darwin?
Yeah, no, in fact, with Darwin, and I, coincidentally, there's one chapter on Darwin in my book, and I have called him a rebellious child.
Okay.
And I've used him as an example of how, he was in fact literally forced by his father to become a doctor. And he in fact went to Edinburgh Medical School and dropped out. And then he was then forced, because his father was a very rich guy and a famous doctor, he then sent him to Cambridge and sort of to learn arts and then kind of settle. So he had some plan, his father had some plan, but there also he kind of almost rebelled and started collecting beetles and doing things which were kind of not very attuned to what he was sent there for. And then he sort of goes on to this journey, which also, I don't think so that he has any kind of inkling of what eventually would emerge out of his collecting specimen. So I think that, when I look at Darwin, I derive those elements and then kind of brought them into this whole outline of a fluid thinker, that he was little sort of, after his daughter's death later on, he became little somber and he was, it was very difficult for him to resolve the sort of this God not existing, and then also his daughter's death, and then what happens after that. So it sort of impacted him in a way that where his work was sort of telling him that, you know, there's no sort of greater force, but at the same time he was kind of fighting with his own battle. And during his journey, I think that he was rebellious, and he kind of, you know, got into that direction. So I whenever I look at these great contributors, I try to kind of arrive at what are the commonalities. And one of the things which emerged in Darwin's case is that he had no plan, and he had no set compass. He had no sort of formula to begin with, and his uncertainty and his kind of experimental attitude eventually sort of took him into the direction of arriving at the theory of evolution. So that's, I don't know whether I have answered.
No,
that.
fantastic. That actually makes sense because I read an article where some people argue that Darwin became religious towards the end of his life. That's one of the arguments, and probably this gives a background to why he's a kind of man of many parts.
Yes.
And then, since you mentioned Crick, then I also expected a question along the lines of what happened to Rosalind Franklin, and so somebody has raised the issue that you know, it should be mentioned also what her contributions to the Nobel Prize. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, of course. So here I was specifically talking about. So, you know, I mean, like, obviously there are controversies and there are a lot of other things whenever we pick up anybody's work. So here I was specifically talking about what he had to say in terms of his sort of background in physics. But obviously, whenever we talk about, you know, anybody for that matter, including Steve Jobs, and, you know, one of the questions came that, you know, if I'm calling him a fluid mind, what about his, was he not sort of, what was his sort of emotional spoke, so to say? So of course, you know, that's what I said, that, you know, it's a very deep concept that, you know, what all dimensions open up. I could eventually get away with not, you know, arriving at the right definition of fluidity. Eventually, I can get away with it. I mean, like when I give example of Steve Jobs, I mean, by no stretch of imagination, I'm saying that he is eventually, you know, he's a perfect person, you know, genius. Or his understanding of, was he aware? No, of course not. I mean, his relationship with his daughter, his emotional side, his professional sort of, you know, I mean, there are a lot of stories about how he kind of conducted himself in his workplace. So it's about, you know, it's like when you're creating this fulcrum of even a person, what it tells you is that obviously you are to be aware of the various dimensions, and there could be a dimension which you're not even aware of, even when you're like 60 or 70 or 80. It's your endeavor to be open. So fluidity requires a particular mindset also. Like, I mean, I take it on a very fundamental and foundation level, that how do you even remain so that you are, you're not guarding yourself, that, okay, I mean, what if I get exposed, I don't know everything. So you're open to it, that, you know, okay, I mean, like, while you're discussing or exchanging views or even introducing yourself to a new piece of knowledge, you are like, maybe I wasn't aware of this dimension, or maybe this particular individual. So if you have the ability to isolate that particular piece of knowledge and then also look at it into this light, okay, this is what he's saying, and there of course are other controversies around him, and you know, contribution of Rosalind, as you said, and even in case of Steve Jobs, it's like, of course you are aware of this particular dimension. You're not like a blind cult follower. You're saying that, of course, I understand this, and this is a dimension which is completely, I mean, he was, one of the dimensions was that, I mean, I also sort of quote that, you know, he had a very twisted view on philanthropy. I mean, like, he did not believe in charity. And that was like one of the sort of, I would say, limitations. So I think that, you know, probably this is what fluidity also kind of convinces me that, if these spokes are dynamic and they are ever, you have to collect them across your life, and be very open and very sort of this, like a true yogi, or like a true, I would say, learner, who is who understands that particular frame, and then you're ever so keen and ever so ready to pick up and then also adapt and change and keep on progressing. Because most of these people, as I mean, even in the case of Gittes, like you get trained as a zoologist, and eventually finally you are known as the founding fathers of urban planning uh, of in England. Like this is something which also tells us that, while most of us would think that never in my imagination I would be able to contribute to a field if I have kind of trained myself into something else. But time and again, these individuals show us that they are willing to break and willing to learn as a newbie. And I think that that's also one of the aspects. So that mindset where you're open and are able to isolate that particular learning from anybody, because if we go into the moral question, I think that anybody and everybody can be questioned.
Excellent. So that was, anyway, that's kind of the other side of the dimension, right? Another dimension in people's life, and we have to take into account. But we are talking about something else. That's being open to various modes of learning and keeping oneself open to new ideas. That is the main thing about fluidity. There's a question about how we tend to group ourselves into scientists or artists, kind of a kinship relationship. This is a kind of basic human behavior.
Well, I would not say that it is. So again, one has to be quite fluid to understand and process that. And like I bring up the work of Harari, who has sort of Sapiens has sort of I would say brilliant conclusions on why a human mind, or why we have come to kind of behaving in a certain manner. And I think that when we kind of marry evolutionary biology and sociology and sort of history and many other spheres, then we are able to actually have some kind of opening in terms of understanding how we have evolved as human beings and as a tribe and as an individual, and the lies and the deceit and honesty and aggression and cooperation and taking taking getting under sort of this label and then being very happy about it. So I think that these are all I mean, to understand that also would require us to break the boundaries and be able to comment on it, that why we actually do that. Now, are we intrinsically label driven? Well, I think that in our society currently, I mean, if I don't follow the tabula rasa approach or like complete blank, I would say that it is very difficult for us to survive as a free thinker. And it is very unfortunate, because that's how things have stacked. Like, what is your eventual purpose of education? I mean, it's livelihood of what kind, money. So the world is changing, but eventually I mean, there is a formula, there is a sort of a route, there's a path which you have to follow, and there is pressure all along: societal pressure, parental pressure, professional pressure, and material pressure, and there is so many sort of forces acting upon you, emotional pressure, and then you give in some at some point in time, and then that is where you start kind of hide behind things which will make your life easy, whether it's a label or whether it's anything else. So if we are born to divide ourselves into identities or labels or molds. As a human mind, I feel maybe we are not. But very soon we lose that ability. I mean, in children, we do see that they have this tremendous spark, and you see them across children. But soon you start seeing them behaving in a different manner based on the parenting and the circumstances, school and their life. And then slowly you start seeing them and then labeling them that, okay, this is a brilliant child, this is not a brilliant child, this is a reserved child, or this is like a very playful child. But actually, if you go back and start kind of understanding, most of the children are beautiful, and in terms of their mind, they're more or less, curious and adventurers and explorers, and they don't discriminate. But soon, because of the way we have kind of stacked ourselves, I think that they start doing so. So I think probably that's what I think, that naturally not, but maybe because of the way things are, we do tend to kind of.
Thank you. And there are lots of questions about how to introduce fluid thinking at the school level,
Yeah.
how to enhance them, and is it not, as you mentioned rightly, about academic culture in schools,
Yeah.
and about modern education system? Can you throw some light on?
I think that most of the teachers are aware of, and so like, again, I mean, it's on one hand it's a classroom question, and also on one hand it's a meta question, or a educational philosophy question. And I think that most of the teachers who consciously became teachers or willingly became teachers, they are aware of what it means to sort of like Froebel, or like who understand that what it takes for, like, I also admire the work of J. Krishnamurti, and his understanding of how to the well-being of a human mind. And I think that those who understand education, or those or APJ Kalam, so they are aware of the fundamentals of this I would say idea, and they practice it, whether they know about it or not. But philosophically, if I say the meta, if you see the meta picture, I think that it's a question of what a particular society, like, I mean, I can be completely bashed here, but like the difference, like, I don't understand the difference between STEM and non-STEM. I mean, whenever I try to understand what exactly we mean by STEM, and what do we then throw out of the picture by saying non-STEM, and what is non-STEM and what is STEM, and what is technology without anything else. I mean, for me, I think that firstly, a society has to be aware, or parents have to be aware on a sort of meta level, that pushing a child so there are a lot of fads in the world where if you push yourself into a particular direction, like if we are as a nation pushing ourselves in the direction of technology, or a STEM, or whatever we call it, as science and technology, or coding for that matter, or teaching our children coding at the age of 3 or 6 or whatever, I mean, I consider it as completely fad, commercial driven exercise endeavor in this particular case of coding, which I'm sort of quoting a particular example of a company in India, or like sort of it has become suddenly, like, it has opened up. I don't know that a lot of companies are there who are now saying that, okay, hang on, we are in the age of machines, and that translates into your child has to know coding, and then you have to pay, and then every conventional model of education is out of the picture. So I think that's the meta thing, that what exactly we understand by education, and how do we so because that eventually trickles into the classroom. And when we come into the classroom, eventually, if these forces are very strong, then little remains inside that classroom. And if a classroom is devoid of all those pressure or all those forces, market, material, otherwise, then probably there is hope that how do you introduce fluidity in the classroom. But I guess that experimental schools, more and more experimental schools, like a society which understands the importance of education, free education, and also that interdisciplinarity is not something which is against specialization. Because suddenly we start seeing push in the direction of science and technology, and then we say that humanities is out of picture, or if you are graduating in this particular sort of non-hard sciences area, this is so there, that's the mindset. And I think that probably maybe we can keep a core of your subjects, but then we can create an environment around those core areas where a child is constantly made aware of what is a fluid mind. So we can, rather than kind of attacking the core and saying that okay, let's start changing every subject and let's start making it look like a fluid subject, we can also have a dual approach of keeping the subjects as it is, maybe because it's very difficult to change curriculum, and then kind of bring a fluid umbrella in your school or classroom or in your teaching, and then making the child aware of that you're not going to get away with just thinking that everything else is useless and I will focus and become, let's say, an engineer. And eventually when you just open up your eyes and see and you say, hey, hang on, I've become redundant in the professional world. So I think that that awareness through the system, society, parents, educationists, into the minds of sort of stakeholders, decision makers, and then, if a school can follow, then bringing that inside the classroom as well.
Thank you very much. That was a very elaborate answer. I think this covers practically other questions about how things can be integrated into the education system, and the importance of fluid thinking, and how do you integrate fluid thinking in engineering, and also bring in arts and other kinds of learning. And just as a tidbit, I want to say that IIT Madras has 50% of the courses are actually elective courses. So that is one way of kind of maintaining the core as well as then opening it out to other, because you have taken courses in physics, chemistry, biology, then also you can take courses in management, humanities, social sciences, and then so that kind of also opens up. But we also see the impact it has on students, probably right not off the bat, but you also see the impact probably 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line, 15 years down the line, when they become leaders and then also grow into their own professions. We can see the attitude and also the way the personality also grows. So fluid thinking really helps. I also feel that way. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashish Jaiswal. And probably I will request Dr. Sachin Gunte, one of the advisors of international relations, erstwhile international relations, but now it's global engagement, to give the word of thanks. Over to Sachin.
Thank you, Professor Darshan. So before now, since the stage is mine, I think not that I asked the question, but I think I really loved it, right? Because of two particular reasons. One is that I'm not really much into this inspirational and philosophical books, but the one which I read was the How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci by Michael Gleb. Probably you know that. And second is your book, which I probably read like few months back, right? That's what I was just telling it, right? And I really find some similarities in between the two books. I don't know why. And then coming back to the fluid thinking, I think as Professor Sudarshan mentioned, in IIT Madras, there are quite a few examples which I know. And personally, I am also probably fits into very small category of fluid example, not necessarily thinking, is that I myself, being a physicist, is the faculty of civil engineering. And then I have had an opportunity to work with one of the Nobel laureates in Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in Mainz. In 1995, he got it. He was a civil engineer by profession. And then one fine day, he just gave up and then got a Nobel Prize in chemistry, right? Anyway, so maybe at some point, I can also assigned to me versus formal with the Siddhi that I think really great job Siddhi is doing, providing a great platform to kind of bring discussion, bring policymakers and NGOs and social entrepreneurs and think tanks like this one. Most importantly, Dr. Ashish for being here, right? You know, personally, it's my privilege to have asked to propose the vote of thanks on a specific day when you have been as a speaker, right? You know, so on behalf of the Office of the Global Engagement, IIT Madras, the entire team, the volunteers, I really extend a very hearty vote of thanks to you for coming up and giving your time. I would really like to mention and emphasize that, like, you know, a deep sense of appreciation specifically for your work. In addition to that, like all the people, those who have been supporting in the back end, I think the entire team headed by Professor Raghu and then Karthik and then Ujjwala and all the people for making this a big success. And then I must really mention that in the recent times, whatever that online webinars, what we call agreeing, I probably didn't see the number touching up to 80 participants in last 5 months or so, right? But that probably shows the popularity and then the hard work the team is putting in there. So thank you very much. And then, of course, at the end of this, like, you know, I personally found it really very inspiring. So thank again, Dr. Ashish for that. And not the last but not the least, that I would really like to thank all the participants who really made it all the way through on a Saturday evening to come for this talk. The next is then look out for this next talk upcoming from one of our colleagues, Dr. Piyush Ghosh, who is also a faculty at the Department of Applied Mechanics and is going to talk about the role of mentoring in nation building. And I think there is one more probably coming up that which they will announce as and when they have the information about it, right? So with this, I would really like to thank everyone present here for attending this interesting talk. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sudarshan.
Thank you very much. That does it for us today. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal. Hopefully we'll be in touch and then we'll continue the association. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
thank you.
Have a nice weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.